This is Passport Necessary, a podcast dedicated to growing up as TCKs and how it's affecting us now that we're adults. And today we'll be talking about St. Patrick's Day.
Woohoo.
Ooh, a day of green. So I'll be honest, I really didn't know what St. Patrick's Day was. I'm still not the most clear about it. I just remember growing up and going to international schools where there was a fairly large American
Yeah.
portion of the student body that around St. Patrick's Day we had to wear green unless you wanted to get pinched really bad all day long. And that was the only association I had with St. Patrick's Day until I became a lot older.
Yeah, it was a similar thing for me because it tended to be sort of like Americans that would introduce me to it as well. Because it is a big thing in the States, which is kind of understandable because there are large Irish communities that have moved over there over the hundreds of years. I mean,
Hmm.
obviously, with being part of the British Empire, it does help to be able to be moved around a little bit in those sorts of situations because you've got the trading connections and all that sort of stuff. And, you know, there was a lot more religious tolerance in the States as well, in a certain sense, than there was in England for a while, so that does actually help. I mean, they would have ended up there for all sorts of reasons.
Hmm.
Um, so taking that with you is one of the kind of things that will keep you tied down to the country that you come from. People like to do that.
Yeah. I mean, it makes
Yeah.
sense. I just know that for me, I didn't really know what it was, um,
No.
other than there was green and that it's
Mm.
supposed to have come from Ireland. That was literally all I knew about St. Patrick's Day was that it was an Irish thing and that you had to wear green or you would get pinched really bad. And that was
Yeah.
my limited knowledge of St. Patrick's Day. And honestly, it wasn't until I moved to Buffalo that I saw like how big of a thing it is
Mm.
for people. So Buffalo, New York has actually a fairly large Irish community, or Irish immigrant community, in the past. It's been many, many decades since that has come to pass, but one of the largest um, St. Patrick's Day celebrations actually take place in Buffalo, New York, as well as
Okay.
Boston. Boston's a really big location for it. They even dye their river green, um, so
Wow.
so that it like follows the whole theme of the day. But yeah,
I don't.
it's
Sorry.
like a whole day thing here. People get ready for it. There's a parade. It's a whole shebang.
Wow. I mean, when they in in Boston they dye the water green.
Yes, they dye the water
After
green.
sort of a check.
There's also another thing where people dye their beer green. So, like green
I've
beer
heard of
on St.
that.
Patrick's
Yeah.
Day, that's
Yeah.
a big thing.
Yeah. I've heard of that stuff. I hadn't heard of anybody dyeing the river. I was just kind of wondering if it's in Boston. Do they call it the Boston Green Tea Party? Um, Sorry, that's really, really stretching it. Sorry, I had to get that out there.
Oh, that was good. But yeah, no, I just know that for St. Patrick's Day they dye the
Mm.
river green and it's like violently green.
Wow. I,
It's not like a slight tint. No, no. It's like someone took a bunch of paint and just threw it in the river and it's bright green.
wow, that's pretty cool actually. Hopefully, it's not toxic. It's just got
No,
some like glowing.
I think they actually try very hard to make sure that it is a
Mm.
non-toxic dye.
Okay, that's good. No, I hadn't heard of that. That's quite an interesting thing to do. I mean, I've heard of people dyeing their beards green and that sort of stuff. You hear jokes about this sort of thing happening and all that kind of thing, like people getting splashed and then the green just ends up all on their shirts and stuff like that and all that kind of thing. I mean, it's probably quite a bit of fun. I don't know if I've ever seen anybody actually do that. Like, I've heard of people doing it. I don't think I've ever actually come across it because in England it's one of those things. It's funny because in Britain I can't remember who the patron saint of Scotland is, which is stupid. I should remember that. But because in Britain you have, well, in the United Kingdom you have four. I can't remember who the Scottish one is, and it'll probably come to me later on. I'll be really angry. There's St David, who's patron saint of Wales, and in England you've got St George, and then in Ireland you've got St Patrick, and the two you see in England are St Patrick and St George. And the thing is that a lot of people don't like the St George one because it's associated with English nationalism. It has a tendency to be sort of, well, a bit racist, basically. Whereas St Patrick is much more considered to be, it's more fun. People are having a good time. It's a much more, it's a pleasant thing. It doesn't. You don't see a bunch of people dressing up in fake chainmail armor and essentially dressing up like medieval Crusader knights wandering the streets. You don't see that on St. Patrick's Day, but you see it on St. George's Day,
Uh,
which is a bit of a shame. I don't know, it's that kind of thing. It's a bit sort of,
yeah.
whereas St. Patrick's Day, I think, just doesn't have that connotation for whatever reason. As Irish pride is much more, it's much nicer, but I think because of the Irish diaspora and all, can you call it diaspora? But I mean, like the movement, the migration of Irish people over the centuries is much less
It's less conquering, it's
unpleasant.
more
Yeah.
for survival.
Yes, yeah. Necessity is like after the famine and all that sort of thing, but then also being part of like armies and things like that of different nations as well. Because I mean, they served the English, but I think that a lot of Irish people were happy to help in the French as well. Because yeah, we'll put it to the Brits. It's all right. Who's gonna who doesn't like the Brits either? Oh, the French. Yeah,
Yeah, we'll fight with the French.
yeah. There were plans. I think partly when Napoleon was around, the British were really frightened of the idea that Ireland would be the back door. That the Irish and the French would sign an agreement because it had happened before. And they worried that there
Interesting.
was going to be an invasion through Ireland. It's
Huh.
happened a few times actually, because the Irish have always wanted independence to a degree. Understandably, there's been wars forever. I suppose that's the thing, isn't it, about St. Patrick's Day? It is about showing your culture and in the face of sort of really serious oppression and real violence.
Mhm.
Um,
I
medieval
I did a
Europe is a
little
pretty violent
research
place.
because I know it was going to bother you. Saint Andrew is the saint of
Right, okay.
Scotland.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
There you go.
Yeah.
Because I knew it was going to bug
Thank
you.
God for that. Yeah, thanks.
But yeah, it's just so interesting to see. Like there are so many people who really get into St. Patrick's Day. Even people who have no Irish descent, who have no connection to
Mm.
Ireland, they don't necessarily care about Ireland, but to them it's a really good time. A lot of people, I think especially in the States, view it as more of an excuse to get riotously drunk. Like to be very honest, like I think for a lot of
Yeah.
people, especially younger Americans, St.
Mm.
Patrick's Day is an excuse to just get wasted, like
Yeah.
totally locked. Which is interesting because the first St. Patrick's Day parade, I did a little research into it, was in 1772, and it
Mm.
was Irish soldiers who were fighting for the English, and they were
Mm.
missing Ireland, so they had on St. Patrick's Day they held a parade in his honor as a way to
Okay.
like remember home while they were fighting in a foreign war.
Mm.
And that was the first like real instance of a St. Patrick's Day parade here in the States. And then over time,
Okay.
it's evolved and changed. The
Mm.
bigger ones are in places where there has been a traditionally large Irish community. Like I said, Boston, Buffalo, New York is
Mm-hmm.
a big one. New
Yeah.
York City has a pretty big St. Patrick's Day parade. But I think over
Mm-hmm.
time, specifically in the States, I think in Ireland it's a very different celebration. But in the States, it's really
Mm.
turned into just kind of the way that Mardi Gras, it's been turned into an
Yes.
excuse to just totally get drunk. Um,
Mm. Yeah, I don't think it's quite like that. It's certainly not. I don't know how much it would. I think it's a bit difficult because I mean the thing is obviously Ireland at the moment is obviously divided into two parts. So you have Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Don't say Southern Ireland because they get upset. It's the Republic. Um, it's important. But I mean I think in Northern Ireland you have like these traditions of doing these sorts of marches and things like that on different sides because obviously you've got Protestants and Catholics and there's still a lot of that there. I mean it's still under the surface and people really worry about it. So I'm not. I think maybe in Northern Ireland it would be more contentious because you do have like what they call the Orange Men who march 12th of July, I think it is, which is a Battle of the Boyne Day. So that's for the Protestants and for the Catholics. Obviously, it'd be St Patrick's Day. So I think maybe in the north it would probably be a bit more contentious. But I mean, in Ireland itself, I mean, I'm assuming that generally speaking, it's actually a more celebratory thing because the Republic is more stable and they're looked after better generally by their government than the north of Ireland is. I mean, we can
mhm.
just see what's happening in recent politics to work out what the rest of Britain thinks of Northern Ireland, or at least what the government of Westminster thinks of them. I mean, it's it's yeah. I suppose that's just the thing, isn't it? It's just that again, it just is because it is a positive thing. It is a fun thing.
It's
you don't
fun. There's
see.
definitely an
Yeah.
air of fun. When you think of St. Patrick's Day, it's supposed to be this very like lively, fun, celebratory event. Like it definitely is a
Yeah.
day of having fun with people. And it's very
Mm.
general. It's very similar to Mardi Gras where it's a community of
Yeah.
people you're celebrating together with instead of celebrating with family or just celebrating with friends. It's the community is coming together
Yes.
to celebrate on a specific day.
Yes. It, and it's a good thing. I mean, and the thing is, it just seems to be anybody can kind of like get involved with it. I mean, I suppose saints are saints, aren't they? I mean, people claim saints, but I mean, you can have them. Anybody can celebrate a saint's day if they want to, obviously. Um, but it's just interesting because of I mean, it's the funny thing is one of these people that we could be pretty sure was real as well. I think because some saints you can't be entirely sure. I mean, it's like in England with St George, you can't. I don't think you can be entirely sure that St George was even real.
Mhm.
I mean, he's supposed to come from Turkey, but whether he was a real man or not, I mean, obviously
It could
went
have been
well. I
like
mean,
an amalgamation of different people
yes,
and then they just put
yes,
all those stories together and they were like it's this one person, whereas with St.
mm,
Patrick it's there is a history that we can look at and say like okay,
yeah,
well, he was kidnapped at 16, brought to Ireland, he
hmm,
escaped, he came back, like there is information about him that we can say okay, this was a real person. Now him
yes,
driving the snakes out of Ireland, hmm,
yeah,
we'll say probably, most likely, definitely not. There were no
yeah,
snakes in Ireland, but I think the fact that he was a real person is pretty
mm.
likely.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to be pretty reasonable. I mean, the story seems to be pretty sensible. I mean, there were slave traders and people did trade people across from Ireland and all that sort of stuff. People were trading slaves from Ireland up until at least into the Viking period, and probably afterwards. I mean, I don't know whether they actually. I think they have found sort of like what we would see from stuff that people have been taken from Africa and centuries later, the same sorts of things you would find in places like Dublin and Ireland, because that used to be a sort of Viking trading port, and they did trade slaves. So the thing is that there probably was a slave trade that was moving around that part of Europe at the time, and the Roman Empire had slaves for forever. I mean, they just kept them anyway. Even when they became Christian, they were trading in slaves.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, it would be it's plausible. Um, I mean, and obviously, like historically, you've also got things like the Irish are definitely people from Ireland were invading into places like Scotland and stuff like that. So the idea that they would come across from Ireland and take someone away who was, living in Wales or in England or something like that is not implausible.
Yeah, no,
Um,
it's
it's
definitely a possibility.
and it probably did happen. I mean, we do know about that sort of thing happening for centuries. I mean, people were still being kidnapped from the shores of Britain until I think at least the 1600s and maybe into the 1700s. There were people who'd been kidnapped from the shores of Britain and taken away into North Africa. So I mean, it's not implausible. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, the other thing that's interesting about St. Patrick is definitely how important he is because, as far as we understand it, there were two strains of Christianity that sort of existed. I mean, once the Roman Empire collapsed, or at least when they left Britain, which is in about 410 AD, that's kind of officially when the Roman Empire ended in Britain.
Mm-hmm.
You had a lot of people who were left behind who were they were the people who'd been there for centuries, but then had been Romanized and kind of like had that, they were probably speaking in Latin and they had or at least some of them could probably speak Latin, and they were living in the way that a Roman would normally expect to live. So
Mm-hmm.
St. Patrick was one of those sorts of people. But the thing is that after the collapse of the empire, you do have movements of people who became ruling classes. So, essentially the Saxons, the Jutes, Angles, and people like that, who came from areas that are basically the same as where the Vikings came from. They had a very similar culture. It's just a couple of hundred years beforehand. They came over and sort of like started to settle. I mean, how many of them there were is a bit difficult to say, but they were pagan. And so paganism moved back into Britain anyway. And so the thing is that the one thing that saved sort of like religion and Christianity in Britain until somebody else came from Rome about 100 years later or more was this sort of Irish tradition of things that had come down from supposedly from St. Patrick taking it over to Ireland. I mean, so there's a kind of a culture in England of doing things that comes from a more Irish or older kind of Christianity that had existed while St. Patrick was alive.
Mm-hmm.
He kind of helped to save it. I mean, the Irish helped to save it as well in Britain anyway.
It's so interesting because we
Hmm.
think of Christianity when we say Christianity as like a very all around umbrella term, and then it's so
Hmm.
fascinating to see I mean, we know that there are all the different split ups. There's Protestants, there's Catholics, there's
Mhm.
Baptists, and all that other stuff. But it is
Yeah.
really fascinating to see how specific it gets. And even within Catholicism, there are different
Yes.
variations of it based on who was the person who was teaching it. So it's really
Yes.
interesting to see how it propagated itself within a specific country and had long-term effects. And it's
Mm.
it's just also so interesting to see how St. Patrick's Day is taken as basically just, like I said, an excuse to get drunk, whereas for the longest time in Ireland, it was seen as a religious day. Um,
Mm.
and in fact, for the longest time, pubs were actually closed on St.
Yeah.
Patrick's Day in Ireland. They were not allowed to be open. And so it's so interesting that up until like the mid 90s, there
Mm.
was finally a movement to start getting people to open pubs up and make it so that people could drink on St. Patrick's Day. But for the longest time,
Mm.
it was a big no no because it's happening during the time of Lent when most
Yes.
people are
Yeah.
supposed to be not having meat, not drinking, they're supposed to be fasting, and then you have
Yeah.
St. Patrick's Day, which is the total opposite of that. You eat meat because you're supposed to eat like Irish bacon and cabbage.
Mhm.
So the bacon part of it is definitely meat. And then you're fasting, so you probably are not supposed to be having alcohol, and that's mostly what people do on St. Patrick's Day. So it's so interesting to see what is taken as a very serious time of year for many Catholics. And the Irish are Catholic, but then they have this one
Yeah.
day where you can just kind of go crazy and have quite a few drinks.
I think that's the thing, though, isn't it? It's just, like these festivals always. There's always this tension between these sorts of things. I mean, the Catholic Church would worry about that sort of thing. I mean, even Protestant churches worried about it. I mean, part of the reason that Christmas was essentially banned in England for a while is because, well, it's a pagan festival. They're all misbehaving, so we can't allow it. It's got to be stopped. And so, they would remove religious festivals on the grounds that people would misbehave and all that sort of thing. So I'm sure that the church would look at things and kind of go, yeah, we don't really want them misbehaving like this. And the church in Ireland was, because it's so strong, it used to be really strongly part of the identity of people in Ireland because of, I think it's less so now. But I mean, the Catholics against the Protestants and all that sort of stuff was really serious for a very long time. And it is because, generally speaking, if you're a Protestant, it meant that you did come from you were more likely to have been moved over to the island of Ireland in order to control the local population.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when you get names that sound Scottish and stuff like that are often people who were brought over who were Protestants from Scotland to rule areas or control things. So normally, if you have names in Ireland like O'Neill or O'Brien or something like that, that's the O suggests that that's an Irish name. But if it begins with MC or MAC, you know, like McIntyre or something like that, it probably means that they were a Scot that came over and they were a Protestant. They were probably part of a ruling class or something like that, or part of it. It's And so the tension between Protestants and Catholics. I mean, it goes back to the time of Henry. I mean, the Irish have not really enjoyed being ruled by the English or the Scots for
I don't think
centuries. They didn't
anyone
like
enjoys
it.
being ruled by
No,
anyone.
no. I mean, they've definitely fought against these people for a very, very long time. But the problem is, of course, because of the religious thing, it became whose side are you on depends on whether you're a Protestant or whether you're a Catholic. And certainly in Northern Ireland, it was a really big deal for a very long time. So I mean, maybe part. I mean, the Republic is less interested now, I think, because obviously they had so many problems with the Catholic Church within Ireland. It's really it's wiped out because
Mm-hmm.
because of the scandals and stuff like that within the church. It's wiped out people's desire to be religious and that sort of stuff. I mean, so I don't know enough about the history of Ireland within the past 100 years or so to be able to say exactly. I mean, I know a little bit about the the independence of the country and the Civil War and that sort of stuff. Then you hear stories about the Black and Tans and all those sorts of people, the horrible things that happen with all that sort of thing. But I don't know enough about what happened sort of through the 70s and into the through and into sort of like more recent times of the country itself. I mean, it's changed drastically. So St. Patrick's Day becomes a thing that can kind of fit into a modern society because it is a national day, which I think people need.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also something that isn't aggressive, it isn't violent, there isn't anything like that in it. It's just, let people have a drink, let people have fun.
Yeah.
We don't need to worry about the religion so much anymore.
Yeah, I think the only thing I always like to warn people if they're doing St. Patrick's Day, especially if you're in a more northern area, it is a lot colder than you think it's going to be. Please wear a jacket. I know it might clash with
Yes.
all the green that you're wearing, but I would rather you be warm than catch hypothermia because you thought it would be cute
Yeah.
to wear uh very little clothes because you were going to be drinking for a
Mm.
while. Just, be smart. Be sure that you have a ride. Don't drink and drive. That's not cute.
Yeah.
Um, and
And don't mix your drinks.
yeah, don't mix drinks and make sure that you're around people that you can trust, that you know will be sure that
Yes.
you get home safe. Because it's good to have fun, but you also want to make sure that you get home safe and that you can have
Mm.
fun the
Mm.
next day. So that was always the thing, like working, because I worked in a restaurant for multiple years
Yes.
during St. Patrick's Day. Of course, we were right near where the parade happened, so we made a lot of money selling food because a lot of people
Mm.
would be drinking a lot, but then would forget to eat. So we set up an outdoor food setting where we would grill burgers
Mm.
outside so people would smell it and they were like, "Oh my gosh, I'm hungry." It's like, "Yeah, you've been drinking for 5 hours. You need to eat something. Like, go ahead and eat something." So that's always something that I just like to remind people is definitely have fun, enjoy all the drinks. I'm not going to be the person to tell you not to drink, but
Mm.
make sure to pace yourself, drink plenty of water, have some food, and get home safe. Because then you'll
Yeah.
definitely have fun the next day. Um, I
Or
think,
at least more. Well, depending on how hungry you are.
yeah, true. Depending on how hungover you are, you'll at least probably have some fun in the afternoon once you've
Yeah.
recovered. But here in Buffalo, yeah, it's really big. I think it wasn't until I moved here that I realized like how big of a deal it was for
Mm.
people because there's like a full-on parade and different communities come together to make sure that this parade happens. Everyone from all like there are people who come from outside of Buffalo who travel internationally
Oh wow.
to come to Buffalo for St. Patrick's Day celebrations. Same thing with Boston. I know that a lot of people
Mm.
travel to Boston so that they can take part in St. Patrick's Day. Very similar to Mardi Gras for New Orleans.
Yeah.
Um, and the only other thing, I don't think we even touched on it, but it seems to be part of the imagery that follows along with St. Patrick's Day is the whole visual of the leprechaun. Um,
Yes.
which is interesting because it has to do with like fairy lore. And
Mm.
the leprechaun is like it's a butchering of a folkloric figure. I'm not even going to try and pronounce it because I will butcher it myself. But Lobaircin. And it just means a small-bodied person, a small-bodied
Mm.
fellow. And leprechauns in folklore were cranky souls that were in charge of mending the shoes of other fairies. And it's just fascinating because over time, they were seen as like very minor figures in Celtic folklore. They weren't even like a
Mm.
major figure, but the one thing they were known for was trickery, and
Right.
they were known for having treasure. And so that's another element of St. Patrick's Day is there's a lot of imagery of gold and having
Right. Yeah.
money and gold. So the idea of having leprechauns around, which are these trickster spirits that protect gold, it kind of meshes together. But it's so
Yeah.
fascinating that this creature that is considered like so minor eventually became like one of the major symbols of this day is the
Yeah.
leprechaun.
It's a kind of almost like a running joke with Irish people, all the stuff about leprechauns. I mean, it's not the only thing. It's almost as if it's the only thing anybody knows about Ireland. It's like what is Irish famous for? Guinness and leprechauns.
Yeah.
That's it. It's just so strange and it's a bit unfair. But I mean, it is generally speaking, it's just that kind of thing. They just go, yeah, leprechauns. It's like, oh god, it must be frustrating.
I'm sure it
It's
is.
just
It has to be because there's so many other elements of Irish culture that are really big and important, and people only think
mm,
of Guinness and leprechauns and clovers, like the four-leaf clover.
yes,
That's pretty
yes.
much like if you say Irish, that's what people will think of.
Yeah, it's really, really weird, isn't it? But it's also interesting how many people like. So it's just like thing, just like talking about how many people actually celebrate it. Is how many people, at least, have somewhere in their history some Irish relative that they can point to within living memory, generally speaking, for a lot of people. It's,
Definitely in the
it's
US in the like
mm,
northeastern region, there are so many traces of Irish culture and Irish
mm,
immigrants that there if you
yes,
live in the northeastern area of the United States, there is a very strong likelihood that you have someone Irish within your family.
yeah, yeah. It's really interesting that it's just because you do hear people sort of like going, yeah, looking back at the history and sort of like saying, oh yeah, I'm German or I'm Italian or particularly in the US, and not so much in Britain, I suppose, but like in the US, you do hear people talking about their heritage being Italian or German or Irish or Scots. Don't hear of English very much, which is interesting. Not surprising, to be fair, but
No, there's still an undercurrent of, yeah, those
yeah,
English.
those,
It's like, that
yeah.
guys, that was hundreds of years ago. Can we get over it?
It, I mean, it's just even within England itself. I mean, certainly in Scotland, there's a huge thing about like Scots who had come from Ireland because of the famine and all that sort of stuff. And Liverpool's another city that has a huge number of people who moved in the 1840s, if I get my dates right. 1848, I think is the correct date for part of the famine, anyway. Um, but a lot of Irish people moved into Britain because obviously Ireland and Britain two separate islands. It's important to remember that. Um, it's it's just interesting because you hear a lot of people saying, "I have Irish heritage." Huge numbers of people. It's in my family. Um, it's all over the place. And in America, how many people actually just go, "Yeah, we're Irish. That's it."
Hmm.
Um,
And it's a big
whereas the
part of
Irish,
identity. A very large part
yes,
of their identity is the fact that they can point to, I have Irish descent. Like, I have family who
yes,
came from there. And it's a
yes,
huge part of how they see themselves within the world.
yes. It's just interesting that that identity is so strong, though. That's what I find interesting about it. It, I mean, I suppose the Italian identity is important in America as well.
Hmm.
Um, but it's
Definitely,
just,
definitely in certain areas, like in New York, if you
mm,
have Italian like descent, there are a lot of people who that is what they cling to. That is a huge part of their
mm.
personality and their identity is the fact that they have Italian descent. There's also big pockets of that in New Jersey as well.
Oh, right, okay.
Hmm.
I suppose it makes sense though, doesn't it? In a way, because it faces the right direction. It faces towards Europe rather than towards Asia, doesn't
I
it?
know
Is
what
what I
you
mean.
mean, but that was so
Yeah,
funny.
it faces in the direction of Europe. It's not. Yeah, that sounded a bit weird. I've phrased that wrong.
No, I loved
It's
it. That was great.
because I suppose yeah, because maybe that's why people in Britain are so sort of like aware of their Irish identity because it's only a short way across the water. And part of what
Mhm.
is the island of Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, so there will be that kind of thing of like, yeah, we perceive you as being sort of part of the country, but not. There's some weird stuff politically to do with Ireland.
Yeah, I was
This
gonna
is
say that
it
also
goes a
is
bit,
part of it.
yeah,
There's a very long, very bloody tradition between Ireland and Britain.
yeah. There was it's going into a bit of dark politics, but I thought it was quite a good joke. As somebody said there's a lot of people in parts of the Europe. Well, I'm paraphrasing it slightly, or was like glossing over certain bits, but somebody said, it's as if members of certain parts of the upper class of Britain and political parties don't really seem to understand that the Irish have gone. It's been 100 years. They're not coming back. If they fail to treat it as a foreign country, which it is, it's just interesting
Hmm.
how big Ireland looms in sort of people's identity and thinking about Europe and stuff like that and the world. You know, the Irish have done a lot for us.
Yeah.
Done a lot. It's just I don't know. It's an interesting one, just because like there's talking about it recently. There have been a few. I think about a year or two ago, there's a really good program on talking about this sort of thing, to do with the famine itself, but then more recently to do with English or British politics. The thing is that Ireland has just been. You can't not talk about Ireland. It's just there. Ireland is just so important in terms of just what's going on at the moment, and it's also important in terms of how the US views um, Britain at the moment, because the British government are just nuts. This
Hmm.
is the nicest way of putting it. But I mean, there was a talk about this because there's this thing of the Good Friday Agreement, which basically means that the Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland have to have the same rules on each side of the border. Essentially, it's kind of breaks down to very simply how it goes. And the British government threatened to break that agreement, and the United States, it was Nancy Pelosi, said, "You do that, you're not getting a trade deal." And the British government went, "Oh, all right, we won't do it then." because the Irish are
Wow.
that important. You know, the Irish are that important. And again, in negotiations with the European Union, what were we going to do about Ireland? It's like, oh yeah, it's Ireland is the linchpin. It's really, really weird how important that country is.
Well,
It's just
there's a
good
history
on
there.
them.
You can't forget about it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And sorry, St. Patrick's Day brings that up into your head, doesn't it? How important the Irish are. They are
Exactly.
important.
There you are. It's a day to celebrate the Irish.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We talked about St. Patrick's Day, how it's a fun day, but again, a reminder: please stay safe while you enjoy your
Mm.
St. Patrick's Day celebrations, especially during a time right now where you really shouldn't be around a lot of people. So, if you're gonna celebrate, do it in
Yeah.
a safe way, please. Um,
Mm.
but thank you so much for joining us today. If you have any questions, comments, you can reach out to us. We're on Twitter at Passport NECESS1, so Passport Nessa1. You can also leave us a comment or a review anywhere our fine podcasts can be found. That definitely would make us super happy because we work hard on this and we enjoy making them, and it really does mean the world to us if you enjoy it as well. Um, but yeah, thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a good rest of the day. Bye.
Right.